Good morning, everybody. Thank you once more for for joining Meta-Analysis 101 in Stats Clinic. Today we'll be talking about how to interpret and write your review. In previous lessons, we've talked about a number of things, right? From why do we do meta-analysis? How do we do meta-analysis, and how do you do all the work? You've taken workshops on how to use your softwares. You've talked about methods. And at the end of the day, after you've done all this work, the reason why you're doing this work is to be able to share it with the public, to share it with the scientific community, to share it with people who would use the knowledge that emanates from the work you've done to actually change either their practice, change policy, or make a change in the world. And there's a way you need to communicate this information. Otherwise, it might be difficult for that information to get out there in a form that's usable for people in the research and the scientific community, or people who are your intended end users. Essentially, because this is a meta-analysis course, we'll be talking about checklists and flow charts. We'll also be talking about general principles of research writing. So why are we talking about checklists and flow charts? Checklists. A lot of times I tell people that checklists are the bare minimum. A checklist is not a writing code book to communicate your research. But here's the thing. If you're leaving stuff out of your checklist, then your research is not, your writing is not yet complete. So there are various checklists, and this checklist emanated from experts in the field coming together and trying to reach a consensus on what are the key elements of a particular type of research that we would need to know, that somebody needs to report for us to agree that this person has at least met a minimum threshold for reporting the work they do, and then they've done. The other aim of this checklist is to ensure that people have reported their work in a way that is reproducible, in a way that can be replicated, and in a way that can generate confidence, in a way that an independent observer, an independent reader can assess the work that's been done and confirm whether the work is sound, both substantively and methodologically. And like I mentioned, there are many checklists, depending on the kind of research you're doing. For people who are doing clinical trials, the construct checklist, which is one of the earliest ones, is a very popular one. But because we're talking about meta-analysis right now, we'll be talking about PRISMA. And as we proceed in this conversation, we'll understand what PRISMA actually means and what that checklist looks like. The second component that is very important to your writing is the flowchart. The flowchart is very important because one of the biggest problems that can make your work uninterpretable is selection bias. And one of the ways, a very important way to allay fears around this is for people to know how you move from the study population, from your target population to the study population to the analytic sample. Meaning, how did you move from the universe of people that you want your research to refer to the population that you're targeting, and from that target population to the people that actually ended up in your analysis? Because between selection, in the process of selection from the target population up until the point where you include certain participants, certain data in your study, that the gap between those two places can make a lot of difference between research that's well conducted and research that's just meaningless. And you'll see what I mean as we go on in this conversation. Now, checklist, like I mentioned, the checklist that is of interest in this course, because it's a meta-analysis course, is what we call the PRISMA checklist. And the essence of the checklist, once more, is for you to be able to look at your report and see that at least You've touched on all the key issues that an independent observer would need to make reasonable judgment about the soundness of your work, right from framing your question to conducting your analysis and interpreting your results. So it's always a good idea to look at your checklist before you start writing or even before you start doing your analysis. Even at this point in the course, I mean, as you started thinking about the work you want to do, it's as you even write your protocols, it's good to get to have a mental map, to have a good sense of what your checklist looks like. Because even though the checklist is not, strictly speaking, a guide to writing, the checklist would not teach you how to write, but the checklist would ensure that you're thinking about all the things that you need to think about when you eventually need to communicate the research that you have done. And given that the PRISMA checklist, just like many checklists, is almost a near consensus among a lot of experts in the field about the items and the issues that need to be reported in the meta-analysis for us to be able to judge whether you've done what you need to do in the meta-analysis. I would now be running through the different items, the checklist items. That's something that you can look up. But fundamentally, when we talk about the principles of research writing, you would see that essentially what this checklist does is tries to put a structure around the principles of research writing as it pertains to a particular kind of research, which in this case is the meta-analysis. So apart from the title, the abstract, the introduction, and methods, the checklist provides detailed items about what are the points that you need to report in each of those areas, in your introduction, in your abstract, in your methods, in your results, and even in your discussion. And just because this is a PRISMA checklist, because this is a meta-analysis, the checklist also includes information on how to report bias or how to report your considerations of bias in the work you have done. So, that essentially is what the checklist is about. But the other item is a PRISMA flowchart. And like I said, essentially a flowchart is a figure that provides information about how you moved from your study population to your target population to your analytic sample. So because this is a meta-analysis, your study population essentially, is a number of studies, not individuals. So you want to be able to show from the point where you went after you've identified your databases and registers and you constructed your search strategy. When you started the search, the first hits that you got, from that point up until the final data that you used in your analysis, you need to be able to show the steps that you moved through from identification to screening to the studies that were eventually included, and the reasons why the ones that did not make it to the analytic sample were removed. And why are we so concerned about this? Because at the end of the day, a meta-analysis is what you get from an analysis depends on what goes into it. So you essentially can say your meta-analysis in a particular way if you're not being objective, just by modulating each of the steps from the universe of studies that you first identified to the group of studies that finally goes into your analytic sample. So the essence of this checklist, the essence of this flow chart is for you to provide information that can allow an independent observer to evaluate how you eventually arrive at this analytic sample, and to allow someone who wants to reproduce or who wants to replicate your analysis to be able to, move exactly from the first hits from the database to the analytic sample that you actually included in your study. And be sure that, well, there is no bias that's being introduced in the course of selecting the studies that finally make the analytic sample. So this is what the PRISMA checklist looks like. Identification, it shows all the studies that were identified, the number of databases that were used, number of registers that were used, the ones that were not used, and then your screening. The number of records screened. It goes through all the stages of your screening, eventually until you report the number of studies that eventually ended up in your analytic sample. So now that we've understood what those two tools, the checklist and the flowchart, now that we understand those two, those are things that you should look at right from the beginning of your study, so that they can guide, so that you have, right from the start, you already have a sense of the things that you would need to write, and you can ensure that as you go through the process, you're covering the bases, you're making provisions, you're keeping notes to be able to provide information that will be required to meet the minimum requirements for a well-reported analysis. So typically, research papers generally would have an abstract, an introduction or background, depending on the journal you're working with, the methods of the methodology section, the results section, the discussion, the conclusion, and depending on how much, and a lot of times you can have supplementary material, because the journals have requirements, limits on the number of tables, number of information, the amount of information that you can include in the body of the paper. Because of those limitations, all the other information, all the other data that's important for interpreting your study, for understanding the report that you've written, then goes into the supplementary material. So we'll start with the introduction. And one advice that we give people quite often is that, an introduction is that part of the study that you write even before you start doing your study. And then when you finish your study, you come back to it to clarify, to reward, to reframe this introduction, depending on what changes have happened so far. Because the introduction is the first thing that someone sees when they look at your study, it is where you need to persuade the reader that this work is actually worth reading, and it's actually worth the effort. And the introduction is not the place where you introduce all the debates and all the conflicts in the field. It is the place where you tell the reader what are the agreed facts in this area of work. So usually, the opening paragraph here, so usually in the introduction, you want to put together short, direct to the point, and informative paragraphs. The first thing you're thinking about is, why do we have to do this study? What is the significance of this study? A lot of times that might border on the epidemiology. A lot of times that might border on the, on the burden of disease that this condition represents. It might be how many people this affects. It might be the severity of the condition. But essentially, it's a statement about why the topic you're looking at is important and why the reader should spend the time going through this paper. So sometimes you're working on an important topic. Hypertension is very important. Diabetes, heart failure. These are conditions that are very important that affect a whole lot of people. Yes. But the question you are trying to answer, but not all questions, not all analysis that's done on heart failure is necessarily important to read. And what makes, beyond the fact that the condition that is being written about, it's important, what else needs to make your paper important? It is, what gaps are you filling? What gaps are you filling? So for instance, let's say anemia is a very big problem. Anemia is a very big problem. But we know but there's been a plethora of studies that answer the question, does iron supplementation affect hemoglobin status? So if that's the question you're answering in this study, the amount of, the significance of your study to someone might be different than if you were looking at this and you're trying to answer a question about whether hepcidin is an important biomarker for anemia. In the sense that, what exactly is the research gap that you're trying to fill? And usually research gaps come, there are different kinds of research gaps that people might be interested in, but it all boils down to two. It all boils down to two areas. One, there are practical gaps, meaning that, is there a practical problem? For instance, should we supplement if a kid shows up in Africa in a clinic? Should we supplement or should we not supplement? We don't know. If we do not know, okay, that's a practical problem that needs solving. Sometimes it's a long-standing debate. Okay, do women, do women, does the progression of HIV in women, is the progression of HIV in women faster than the progression of HIV in men? That may not be, that might not have so much influence on what we do in practice in the clinic, but it might be a long-standing debate that people have been, that many people in the field have been worried about, and that I've been worrying about, and you have a lot of primary studies on it. A lot of times when we do meta-analysis, the most important research gap is the fact that there are primary studies that have looked at the question we're looking at, but there are studies that are supportive of one position, while there are other studies that are conflicting with that position. And the meta-analysis is an attempt to align and reconcile some of these studies to have an average effect estimate. So whatever the research gap is, part of the ways to motivate the reader to go further in reading your report is to clearly state what your research gap is after you've demonstrated the significance of the condition, of the overall condition that you're talking about. And after you talked about the research gap, you want to articulate the study goals. A lot of times we do this by stating very clearly what are the objectives, or what are the exact questions, the specific questions that we ought to answer in this study. So a good way to think about about what material can go into your significance is to think about the 5 W's. What exactly is the condition you're thinking about? At what stage in its progression, or at what stage in its natural history, or at what stage in the biological history? Where? Who does it affect? Why does it affect them? And how? Those are some of the things that you might want to articulate to talk about the significance and burden, as well as the context of the work you're doing. In general, the points that have been articulated here are points that points that are accepted as facts, not the controversies and the debates. We will talk about those later. So I spoke a little bit about the research gap earlier. Like I said, there are so many ways to think about the research gap to motivate your work. But practically a lot of times, we want to talk about what is the practical gap that you're feeling, meaning that by the time we read through your report, learning about the things that the analysis you've done, is there something that we would be able to do differently, or something that we would need be able to reinforce in what we do as public health practitioners, or as clinical practitioners, or in terms of the economic significance of some of the things we do. So also because there's a lot of primary studies, sometimes there are reviews that have looked at studies relating to the particular condition you're looking at. Sometimes you need to be much more specific and differentiate why your why your research gap is different from some of the research gaps that other people or other studies have been looking at. So at the end of the day, at the end of the introduction, basically you want to talk about, well, now that you've told us why this overall condition is very important, you've told us about things that we do not know, that if we knew them, we would be better public health practitioners, or better policymakers, or better clinical practitioners, or something that's a long-standing knowledge gap, something that people have been yearning to know, that people don't know, that you think that your work would be able to address. Now tell us what you want to do about it. What is the specific question that you want to answer about this gap? And broadly speaking, what is the approach you're taking to you plan to take to answer these questions? So with those, you would have a comprehensive introduction. You have an introduction where somebody reads through and feels like, well, let me go further and see what exactly you've done, and then evaluate whether the work you've done actually fills the gap that you've claimed that you wanted to fill. And how do we evaluate whether the work you've done actually fills that gap? The first step is to look at your methods. Now, the goal of the methods, and when you look at the checklist again, you're going to see that the goal of the method is to provide sufficient information in sufficient detail for someone else to be able to reproduce or replicate this study, just based on the information that's provided in your report. And because this is the meta-analysis, it all starts from your search strategy. What databases were you planning to look at? Because if you did not identify what databases you looked at, if somebody searches a different range of database, they can end up with a different set of studies. So let's know what databases you're looking at. The other reason why we're looking at databases is that it allows the reader to judge whether they think that you've actually covered the range of databases where the studies that are speaking to the question you're interested in would be domiciled. Now, after you move from so after you identify the databases you're looking at, you're also articulating your search terms and how you constructed your search terms. Because the search terms can have significant influence on what hits you get and what hits you don't get. So if somebody's going to replicate this and the person would hope to get exactly the same results that you got, they should be able to know the exact search terms and how you concatenated those search terms and how you combined your search terms to be able to arrive at what you have. The next thing is, now that you have a search term, you have these databases, and you run your search, and you have all these hits, how do you move from there to the studies that you actually include in your analysis, your analytic sample? That comes down to your study criteria. There has to be criteria for moving from all those thousands of hits that you got to the final sample that you would do the final studies that you include in your analysis. And you have to articulate those criteria. So if somebody wants to replicate the study, if they work with the same criteria, they can fairly, they're fairly likely, they are highly likely to come to the same set of studies that you have in your final analytic sample. And then now that we have the analytic sample, you have your extraction sheet. You have your extraction sheet that identifies what information exactly you want to extract from each of the studies that ends up in the analytic sample. And then you can describe the analysis you did, the methods you used, and the softwares you used in conducting that analysis. Because sometimes, even for some of these methods, the way they are implemented can be software specific. So these are key elements that need to be included in your reporting of your methods for someone to have at least minimal confidence that they're able to evaluate and they're able to judge how much confidence they should place on whatever comes out, whatever you report as a result of your methods. So after you've written out your methods, the next thing is to go to your results. Now, the results is the place where you bring in the tables. But whatever table you're putting in the results, ensure that you are calling out the tables and you're explaining what you have in the tables in text. And you have to sit down and think about a mutually exclusive and completely exhaustive set of tables, meaning that tables that are mutually exclusive, meaning that the information in one table does not show up in another table, and they are completely exhaustive. That by the time you look at all the tables included all together, you can get a full picture of the information of what's been found in this study. So usually the first table and the first paragraph talks about the population in general, the overall population that ended up in the analytic sample. It's a good idea to use subheadings, especially if you've done multiple analysis, because it signposts people to know what they should be looking for when they start reading through the paragraphs. So here is not a place where you editorialize a lot. This is where you talk about the facts. This is what we found. We conducted this analysis. This is what we found. This is the effect measure. And this is its magnitude. This is its direction. And this is its statistical significance. This is the test we conducted. Ensure that you're using appropriate epidemiology and scientific terminology. As a starter, if you're starting to write, one good practice is to look for a very good paper that's similar to the work you're doing and kind of pattern your work, your reporting around that. So ensure that you call out all the tables you have and you explain everything you have in each of the tables. Avoid reporting the same data more than once. Don't present the same data in more than one table or more than one figure. And you have to be careful about the choice of what you choose to put into these tables and the choice of what you choose to ignore. So I've seen people who put in just the positive findings. No, that's not it. The aim here is not to talk about just interesting findings, is to give a comprehensive report of what you found from the analysis that you claim that you wanted to do in the methods. And after that, when you're done with results, now you're in the territory of discussing your results. So just like in the other sections, a good practice to make your report readable is to work with paragraphs. Work with paragraphs. Paragraphs that have clear headings. And the paragraph basically has a topical sentence that basically articulates what is this paragraph about? What is the claim you're making? And then it goes out to lay out the reasons why you're making this claim and the evidence that backs up these reasons. So in your discussion, the first paragraph you're talking about, on a very high level, remind us of what you did in this study and what you found summarily. And then you have to write a bunch of paragraphs that explain this, the findings that you talked, the findings that you presented in the results section. And try, in the course of explaining that, if they are conflicting, if the course of explaining that if there are key studies that have arrived at conflicting outcomes, you want to provide explanation. You want to, at times it is conjectures about what the differences might be, about why these differences might have occurred. Sometimes you'll find other studies or other reasons that align, that strengthen or confirm the results that you found in the study also. Never forget to identify the limitations and strengths that you think are unique to your studies, or that you think make your study worth the while. Those are things that come up under the discussion, and then you should have a conclusion. So this slide just talks about the structure of a paragraph that helps readers to be able to follow the thought process with clarity. Lead with a topical sentence that summarizes the claim or the assertion that this paragraph is about. What are the reasons why you believe this? And what is the evidence that backs that up? And if there are conflicting viewpoints that are worthy of note, it is better to acknowledge them than to ignore them. So at the end of the day, after you've talked about your discussions, you might now want to articulate what are the implications of these results that you found, that you discussed. What are the implications for practice, or the implications for further research? And implications for practice can run the whole gamut. It might be implications for our public health practice, or for clinical practitioners, or for policymakers. But enough times you see studies that are well done, well written, well articulated, a lot of work. But then the author can now link the results, the findings that they've done, that they put in all the effort to arrive at, to the actual implications, the usability of these findings. And sometimes people overstating or just overstretching the usability or the implications of the findings. That really turns off reviewers, that turns off a lot of readers, because they start asking whether they can actually trust a lot of the things that they've read earlier on in your report. So essentially, the point we're making, what we're taking away from this class, is that a meta-analysis is a specific type of study that has a checklist that experts in the field have really forged a consensus on as the basic minimum of the items that need to be reported from your work for an independent observer to be able to judge the quality of the work that you've done in the meta-analysis. And that's a PRISMA checklist. Also, the flow chart, it's really important. But at the end of the day, a checklist and a flow chart is not a substitute for really sticking to the principles of good research writing. Think about the structure of the work you've done, right from the introduction to your methods, to your results, to your discussion and conclusion. In each of those sections, think about the structure of the paragraphs that go into each of those sections. The paragraph should come with topical sentences that articulate the claims and assertions that paragraph that paragraph is elucidating. What are the reasons why people should believe this claim? And what's the evidence backing up those reasons? So thank you very much for being part of this class, and thank you very much for being part of this course. We hope that all the work that's been done in this course so far has been useful for you, and the skills that you've acquired in the course of this course will serve you well as you go forward. Thank you very much, and have a good day. Bye.